In the years before World War II, as the great powers maneuvered under the shadow of another global conflict, the United States Navy found itself confronting a paradox. The country was blessed with vast industrial capability, yet bounded by political hesitation and international treaty constraints. Out of this tension emerged a ship that, despite being among the most formidable naval weapons America ever produced, would spend decades overlooked and undervalued. Her name was USS Washington, BB 56. This documentary begins not with the thunder of guns at Guadalcanal, but with the quieter clashes of ideology, naval doctrine, and international diplomacy that forged the circumstances of Washington's birth. For Washington was more than steel and machinery, she was a response, an answer to a world rearming, a world inching toward the inevitable. This is the story of how the U.S. Navy created its most efficient, most deadly, and most disciplined battleship, the one that would go into the crucible of iron-bottom sound and emerge untouched, having changed the course of a campaign and the trajectory of the war. To understand USS Washington, we must first understand the world that shaped her. The First World War had ended with the major naval powers exhausted and weary. Dreadnoughts had been built in incredible numbers, consuming national treasuries and fueling rivalries. Determined to prevent another unrestricted naval arms race, diplomats gathered in Washington, D.C. in 1921 for what would become known as the Washington Naval Conference. The result was the Washington Naval Treaty, which placed strict limits on battleships. Maximum displacement, 35,000 tons. Maximum main gun caliber, 14 inches. Limits on total numbers per nation. The treaty was hailed as a triumph of peace. But to admirals and naval architects, it was a straitjacket. The United States Navy faced a dilemma. How do you build a battleship powerful enough to deter adversaries, but constrained enough to satisfy the diplomats? 2 decades later, USS Washington would be the answer. The 1930s were a time of rising tension. Japan withdrew from treaty agreements. Germany rearmed. Italy sought empire. The old framework of naval limitations began to crumble. The U.S. Navy responded with a new class of battleship, the North Carolina class, of which Washington would be the second. At first glance, the class seemed to follow treaty rules. They were designed to fit the 35,000-ton limit and mount 14-inch guns. But this seemingly compliant design masked extraordinary innovation. Washington and her sister were to be faster, more heavily armored, and more technologically advanced than any American battleship built before. But getting that design accepted was not easy. Deep inside the Bureau of Construction and Repair, a dangerous idea circulated. Why not build these battleships with 16-inch guns instead of 14-inch? The problem was political, not technical. The U.S. had agreed to limit itself to 14-inch guns unless another nation escalated. When Japan refused to commit to the smaller caliber, the Navy seized its opportunity. In July 1937, the U.S. invoked the treaty's escalator clause, allowing 16-inch guns. Washington's final armament became 9 16-inch/45 Mk6 guns in triple turrets, each shell weighing 2,700 pounds. Capable of firing 20 mile. Among the most accurate naval guns ever developed. This change alone turned Washington from a treaty compromise into a potential fleet dominator. A battleship is only as strong as its protection. Naval architects faced a challenge. How do you give a 35,000-ton ship enough armor to withstand modern shells? The solution was a revolutionary concept called the all-or-nothing armor scheme, first used in U.S. battleships in World War I but refined here to its peak. Washington's armor layout was designed around a cold, brutal calculus. Protect only the vital machinery, magazines, and command spaces. Leave non-essential areas with minimal armor. Reinforce the citadel with state-of-the-art high-tensile steel. The armor scheme included a 12-inch main belt, angled to increase effective thickness. A 5.5-inch armored deck, resistant to plunging fire. 16-inch turret faces. Extensive underwater protection against torpedoes. This made Washington one of the toughest ships afloat, able to take punishment from battleships of her own size. But the ship's most important advantage was not armor. It was something far more modern. Washington entered a naval world still dominated by tradition, visual spotting, signal flags, and gunnery practices developed in the dreadnought era. Night battles were feared. Storms were feared. Anything limiting visibility was dangerous. Then came radar. By the late 1930s, U.S. scientists working on microwave technology had created the CXAM-1 radar, a primitive but groundbreaking system capable of detecting ships and aircraft beyond visual range. USS Washington would become one of the first American battleships to receive this technology. For her time, she was an electronic predator, capable of detecting enemy ships at night, capable of directing fire control through radar input, capable of tracking targets in total darkness, capable of fighting effectively in conditions where the Japanese excelled. It was this edge, this invisible lens piercing the night, that would one day make Washington the deadliest ship in Iron Bottom Sound. The North Carolina-class battleships were designed for a new era of warfare, one where mobility mattered as much as armor. Older American battleships cruised at 21 knots, too slow to keep up with carriers. But Washington needed to escort fast carrier groups, respond to distant threats, and maneuver aggressively in battle. The solution: 121,000 shaft horsepower. For massive turbines. 28-knot top speed. This made Washington one of the fastest battleships in the world at her commissioning. Speed gave advantages. She could dictate the terms of engagement. She could keep pace with carriers like Enterprise. She could chase, flee, pivot, redeploy. She could flank enemy formations. She could refuse battle and survive. To the crews that trained on her in 1941, Washington felt alive, a machine built to move, built to strike. Commissioned in May 1941, Washington arrived just months before Pearl Harbor. The crew was young. Nearly half were under 21. Many had never seen the ocean before, but wartime urgency forged them fast. Washington's early service was in the Atlantic, where the U.S. feared Germany's battleships might break into convoy lanes. She escorted British ships. She practiced coordinating with aircraft carriers. She drilled hard at night, searching for enemy shadows in the dark. This was critical preparation for what lay ahead. Because while Washington patrolled the cold waters of the North Atlantic, a chain reaction exploded in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor was attacked. The battleship fleet was crippled. And suddenly, USS Washington became one of the most important and modern battleships America still had. Though Washington never fired her guns in anger in the Atlantic, her time there was not wasted. The Navy discovered something profound. Washington's crew became one of the most disciplined in the fleet. This discipline stemmed from endless gunnery drills, harsh weather operations, carrier escort duty, joint maneuvers with British forces, nighttime radar trials, long patrols against German surface raiders. Officers later said that Washington's crew became a machine, precise, efficient, calm under pressure. They did not yet know it, but these qualities would save the ship, and the entire Guadalcanal campaign. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War was raging. Carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, defined the new era. Many believed battleships were obsolete. But the war around Guadalcanal changed everything. Aircraft carriers were vulnerable. Aircraft were limited by weather and night. Japanese destroyers and cruisers dominated the dark waters. The U.S. Navy needed something with heavy armor, heavy guns, radar-directed firepower, the ability to withstand torpedoes. They needed a battleship built for night fighting. A battleship with discipline. A battleship with radar. A battleship that could fight blind. They needed USS Washington. And so, after months of Atlantic service, Washington was ordered south. Her destination. A place where battleships would fight again, not in daylight volleys across calm seas, but in a swirling, moonlit hell where radar, nerves, and discipline mattered more than any tradition. As Washington steamed toward the Pacific, she was unknowingly heading toward the battle that would define her legacy. But before she arrived, her crew underwent their final transformation. Washington's gunnery crews practiced firing in total darkness, guided only by radar. Engineers practiced emergency damage control drills until they could seal compartments blindfolded. Lookouts learned to scan the night, even though radar would beat their eyes. Officers ran simulations of night battles based on intelligence about Japanese tactics. Fire control teams mastered the Mark 8 radar system, the most advanced naval targeting tool in the world. The ship became a weapon forged not just in steel, but in training, repetition, and sheer professionalism. A ship can have the best guns, the best armor, and the best radar, but it means nothing without leadership. To complete the sharpest blade, Washington received one final, decisive element. Admiral Willis H. Ching Lee. A master of gunnery, a pioneer of radar, a calm, analytical commander, a veteran respected by every sailor who served under him. Lee believed in Washington. He trusted radar when other admirals still doubted it. He trained his officers to think like hunters. He prepared Washington not for a traditional battle, but for the one that was coming, the one that would be fought at night, the one that would decide the fate of Guadalcanal. And so Washington arrived in the South Pacific, powerful, tested, disciplined, and led by the one admiral who could use her full potential. The blade was ready. The forge was complete. What remained was the strike, convoy defense and early skirmishes. This continues the same History Channel style, long-form narrative, and will cover Washington's early Pacific service leading up to Guadalcanal. When USS Washington arrived in the Pacific, the war was already raging across thousands of miles of ocean. The Japanese had seized the Philippines, much of the Dutch East Indies, and a chain of islands that created a defensive buffer around their empire. Allied forces, still reeling from early defeats, scrambled to stabilize supply lines, defend key positions, and secure bases for future offensives. Guadalcanal, with its small, hastily completed airfield, had suddenly become a linchpin in the struggle for the Pacific. Whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the skies over the Solomons, the surrounding waters, and the routes through which both sides supplied and reinforced their troops. For USS Washington, the early months in the Pacific were not glamorous. Unlike the later carrier battles that would dominate headlines, her first missions were intense, perilous, and invisible to the public. Convoy escort duty consumed hours, days, and weeks. Every sortie across open ocean risked submarines, aircraft, and surprise surface attacks. The Japanese Navy had mastered night operations, and destroyers armed with long-range torpedoes prowled the darkness. Washington, with her radar and heavy guns, was designed to counter precisely these threats, but theory and practice were never the same. The ship's crew quickly learned this. The Pacific tested everything they had been drilled in the Atlantic. Gunners practiced rapid targeting, engineers monitored her engines relentlessly, and lookouts strained their eyes for the fleeting glimmer of a periscope or the reflection of a searchlight. At night, the Pacific became a different world. Rain fell in sheets. Smoke from burning ships obscured the horizon. The water itself seemed alive with danger, and every convoy became a fragile thread connecting distant islands. Every decision, every misfire, every delay could be fatal. The first major challenge for Washington came during convoy operations near the Solomons. Japanese submarines had begun operating aggressively in these waters, sinking transports and supply vessels that were critical for the Marines holding Guadalcanal. In these missions, Washington's radar gave her an unprecedented advantage. She could detect contacts beyond visual range, guide destroyers to intercept, and, if necessary, engage surface threats before the enemy realized she was present. These missions demanded patience and discipline. Unlike the spectacle of a battleship duel, convoy defense required constant vigilance. There were no fireworks, no headlines, only the quiet, deadly application of speed, firepower, and radar-guided coordination. During one particularly tense night operation, a Japanese submarine attempted to infiltrate the convoy. Radar operators detected a small, fast-moving contact approximately 3,000 yards off the port bow. The gunnery officer ordered the main battery to stand by, while destroyers closed in. After tense minutes of maneuvering, the submarine was forced to dive, abandoning its attack. The crew of Washington barely celebrated. In these missions, success was measured in survival and in the uninterrupted delivery of troops and supplies, often hundreds of men whose lives depended on the ship's vigilance. It was in these nights, in these routine yet deadly patrols, that the crew of Washington honed the precision and confidence that would later define their performance in Guadalcanal. By late summer 1942, the ship's routine patrols brought her closer to the heart of the campaign. The Marines on Guadalcanal were under relentless pressure. Japanese forces had already attempted several amphibious landings. Henderson Field was constantly under threat from bombardment, air raids, and supply interdiction. Intelligence indicated that a major Japanese offensive was imminent, including not only reinforcements by destroyers but also a surface attack by heavy cruisers and a battleship. The situation required a fast, heavily armed ship that could operate in darkness and strike with devastating effect. For the Navy, there was no alternative to Washington. During these months, the ship also participated in joint operations with cruisers and destroyers. These smaller vessels performed scouting, screening, and screening advance functions, while Washington remained the central gun platform, the hammer, in a hammer-and-anvil strategy. Night exercises became increasingly sophisticated. The crew practiced detecting simulated Japanese formations on radar and directing coordinated fire with multiple ships. Engineers tested damage control measures under simulated torpedo strikes. Every crew member, from the youngest seaman to the gunnery officers, was conditioned to respond instinctively, relying on discipline, procedure, and the ship's technology rather than chance or luck. This period of relentless preparation produced several key advantages. First, the gunnery crews became astonishingly precise. Radar-directed salvos, fired without visual confirmation, were practiced repeatedly until timing, correction factors, and firing solutions were second nature. Second, the bridge team became fluid, able to make tactical decisions under pressure without confusion. Third, the entire ship, engineers, gun crews, communications personnel, damage control teams, functioned as a single, cohesive machine. By the time Washington approached Guadalcanal, she was not merely a ship, she was a well-oiled instrument of war. The first surface engagements for Washington came in preliminary skirmishes with Japanese destroyers and light cruisers attempting to reinforce their positions in the Solomons. These actions were typically night operations, characterized by sudden flashes of gunfire, brief exchanges of torpedoes, and rapid withdrawal into darkness. Each encounter tested the radar systems, the fire control teams, and the discipline of the crew. Unlike the dramatic carrier battles or daylight cruiser engagements, these night skirmishes were unforgiving. Visibility was near zero. Errors were deadly. Coordination required absolute trust in technology and the shipmates alongside you. Despite the danger, these engagements revealed the lethal potential of USS Washington. On one occasion, radar operators detected a Japanese destroyer approaching a vulnerable transport. The main battery opened fire, guided entirely by radar, and the destroyer was forced to retreat before it could launch torpedoes. On another mission, a Japanese cruiser squadron approached under cover of darkness. Washington's rapid and coordinated fire forced the enemy to scatter, sparing the convoy and frustrating their mission. These small victories, though largely unnoticed at the time, were critical in building the confidence of the crew and establishing the reputation of Washington as a ship that could dominate night engagements. The months leading up to the critical November offensive at Guadalcanal were a crucible in every sense. For sailors, the South Pacific was a test of endurance. Tropical storms battered the decks. Mosquitoes, disease, and heat tested human limits. Ships were constantly on alert for air raids or submarine attacks. Yet, even in these trying conditions, Washington's crew trained relentlessly. Drill followed drill. Fire control exercises followed gunnery practice. Damage control exercises were carried out as if real battle had already begun. The ship itself, a marvel of engineering, responded impeccably to each command. Machinery rarely faltered. Radar systems performed flawlessly. The combination of technology and preparation gave the sailors confidence that their ship could survive the coming inferno. By early November 1942, intelligence indicated that the Japanese were preparing to send a battleship and a cruiser force to bombard Henderson Field and reinforce Guadalcanal. This intelligence transformed Washington's mission from routine convoy escort to the central role in a potentially decisive engagement. Naval Command placed immense trust in the ship's capabilities and her crew's skill. For the first time, the full potential of the North Carolina-class design would be tested against a major Japanese warship in a true combat scenario. As the fleet gathered, the sailors aboard Washington felt a combination of tension and purpose. For months, they had trained for this moment. The months of escort duty, night patrols, and skirmishes had prepared them. Every radar operator, every gunner, every engineer knew that the upcoming engagement would demand their absolute best. They would not have the luxury of clear daylight or visual confirmation. The battle would be fought at night, in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound, against a skilled and well-armed adversary. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of Guadalcanal, the lives of thousands of Marines, and the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. Washington had been forged in preparation. She had been tested in combat skirmishes. And now, as the fleet steamed toward the Solomons, she was ready to fulfill the destiny that her designers, engineers, and crew had meticulously prepared her for. This combination of technology, discipline, and strategy set the stage for the night battle that would define her legacy. USS Washington was no longer merely a battleship, she was a calibrated weapon, a precision instrument of war, and the linchpin of America's efforts to hold Guadalcanal. And yet, even as the crew readied themselves, they could not know the scale of what was about to happen. The coming night would test every lesson learned, every drill practiced, every ounce of engineering excellence embedded in the ship. It would demand perfection. There could be no margin for error. The Pacific Crucible had claimed many ships, many lives. Washington was about to face its ultimate trial. By November 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had become a grinding test of endurance, courage, and strategy. The Marines on the island were exhausted, supply lines were precarious, and the Japanese were relentless in their efforts to retake the initiative. Every night, destroyers and cruisers slipped past the U.S. screening forces to deliver reinforcements and supplies. Every night, American sailors faced the uncertainty of hidden torpedoes, lightning-fast Japanese maneuvers, and the constant threat of sudden, devastating shellfire. The waters around Guadalcanal had earned a grim nickname, Iron Bottom Sound, a watery graveyard for dozens of ships that had already fallen. It was into this lethal environment that USS Washington entered the stage. She was joined by her sister ship, USS South Dakota, as part of Task Force 64, under the command of Admiral Willis Ching Lee. Intelligence had detected a Japanese task force moving to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements. The enemy included heavy cruisers and the veteran battleship Kirishima, a ship that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and had already earned a fearsome reputation among U.S. sailors. The stakes were unprecedented. If the Japanese succeeded, Guadalcanal might fall. If the U.S. fleet failed, the Marines, airfield, and entire strategic position in the Solomons would be lost. The night was pitch black, rainy, and turbulent, a nightmare for navigation, a challenge for human perception, but an opportunity for the American advantage, radar. While the Japanese relied on optics and searchlights, Washington's radar operators could track targets invisible to the naked eye. This technological edge would prove decisive. As the American ships approached the coordinates of the expected Japanese fleet, tension gripped the crews. Sailors had drilled for this moment countless times, but there was no rehearsal that could fully prepare them for the chaos of a live night battle. They understood that survival, success, and the future of the campaign rested on split-second decisions, perfect gunnery, and flawless coordination. The first contact came in the form of Japanese destroyers attempting to scout the American approach. Washington's radar operators detected them immediately. Rather than reveal her presence, the ship held its position, guiding the destroyers into prearranged engagement zones where U.S. screening forces could intercept them. In the darkness, torpedoes streaked past and shells splashed into the water, but the American crew remained calm. Years of training had taught them to trust the ship's systems and their own preparation. At 23:17 hours, the Japanese fleet began to reveal itself. Searchlights momentarily illuminated South Dakota, catching her in a deadly spotlight. Shells slammed into her superstructure. Fires broke out. Electrical systems failed. South Dakota became a target, isolated and vulnerable. The Japanese, believing they had identified the main American battleship, concentrated fire on her, confident that victory was within reach. Washington, undetected in the blackness, was now in position. Admiral Lee, analyzing the radar plots, identified the primary threat, Kirishima, the battleship that represented both the enemy's firepower and the potential destruction of Henderson Field. Lee made a calm, decisive order: open fire. The moment was extraordinary. 9 16-inch guns, each capable of launching a shell the size of a small car, roared in unison. Radar-directed salvos streaked across the dark water toward Kirishima. Every gun was firing under precise control, aimed not by eyesight but by electronic tracking, prediction, and calculation. For the Japanese, the first salvo seemed almost impossible. How could a ship invisible in the darkness strike with such accuracy? The results were devastating. Within minutes, shells penetrated Kirishima's turrets, decks, and engineering spaces. Fires erupted, explosions rocked the hull, and the ship began to list. Steering jammed. Confusion spread among the Japanese crew. Attempts to return fire were erratic, as Washington remained unseen and untouchable. Secondary guns and destroyer support added to the chaos, inflicting further damage and breaking the cohesion of the Japanese formation. In just 10 minutes of furious combat, Washington had altered the course of the battle. Kirishima, the veteran battleship, was mortally wounded. Japanese commanders realized the mission had failed. Orders to retreat were issued, transports carrying troops reversed course, and the plan to bombard Henderson Field was abandoned. The Marines on Guadalcanal, who had faced days of relentless Japanese attacks, remained in control of their airfield. The tactical and strategic impact of this engagement cannot be overstated. One ship, operating with superior training, technology, and command, had shifted the balance in a critical theater of the Pacific War. For the crew of USS Washington, the battle was both triumphant and sobering. They had executed everything perfectly, but they also witnessed the chaos and destruction that combat wrought. Smoke, fire, and the echoes of exploding shells filled the night. Sailors navigated flooded compartments, extinguished fires, and maintained control under immense pressure. The battle validated every hour of training, every drill, and every design decision that had gone into creating the North Carolina-class battleships. Historically, this engagement would later be recognized as one of the most decisive night battles in naval history. It demonstrated the effectiveness of radar-directed gunnery, the importance of crew discipline, and the tactical advantage conferred by technological innovation. Yet at the time, media coverage focused largely on the broader campaign or on carrier victories, leaving Washington's achievement underappreciated by the public. In the aftermath, the ship continued to support operations in the Solomons, escorting convoys, engaging enemy destroyers and cruisers, and performing shore bombardments to assist the Marines. Each sortie reinforced the lessons learned in that pivotal night battle. Radar-guided fire control became standard practice, and the ship's systems were continually refined. Washington's duel with Kirishima marked a turning point not only for the Guadalcanal campaign but also for naval warfare itself. It confirmed that a battleship could still dominate the battlefield under the right conditions, despite the growing prominence of aircraft carriers. Radar had neutralized the traditional advantage of night operations and surprise. Crew training had ensured flawless execution. And leadership, exemplified by Admiral Lee, had orchestrated a victory that combined precision, patience, and overwhelming firepower. The night of November 14 to 15, 1942, became the defining moment in USS Washington's service. The battle was short, intense, and decisive, a perfect combination of design, technology, training, and leadership. Kirishima was lost, the Japanese bombardment plan collapsed, and Guadalcanal remained in American hands. The Pacific War's trajectory shifted, and yet the story of this battle, and of the ship that won it, would remain largely unknown outside naval circles for decades. Even as the Pacific campaign continued, the legend of Washington grew among those who served aboard her. Officers and sailors recounted the precise coordination, the calm under fire, and the sheer power of her guns. The combination of radar, speed, armor, and crew training created a ship capable of feats previously considered impossible. This was not mere luck, it was the result of years of careful design, preparation, and leadership. Following the battle, Washington continued to participate in operations throughout the South Pacific. She escorted carriers during raids in the Solomon Islands, provided naval gunfire for amphibious landings, and tested her systems against both air and surface threats. Though she did not again face a battleship in direct combat, the impact of her Guadalcanal engagement resonated through subsequent operations. Every commander, every crew member, and every ship that trained alongside her learned from her performance, cementing her place as one of the most important ships of the war. Despite this extraordinary service, Washington's fame did not spread. Unlike carriers like Enterprise or battleships like Missouri, she did not become a public icon. Newspapers and radio reports highlighted larger campaigns, air battles, and headline-grabbing naval actions, leaving the quiet precision and deadly effectiveness of USS Washington largely unacknowledged. Yet for those who served aboard her, and for the historians who later examined her operations, the ship's legacy was undeniable. She had performed one of the most remarkable naval feats of World War II, a feat defined not by numbers of ships sunk, but by strategic consequence, precision, and innovation. With the Guadalcanal campaign secured and the Japanese surface threat neutralized, USS Washington entered a new phase of service, one defined less by headline-grabbing battles and more by consistent, reliable, and indispensable support across the Pacific. The ship's role now shifted to convoy escort, carrier group protection, shore bombardment, and naval gunfire support for amphibious assaults, demonstrating the versatility of a battleship in an era increasingly dominated by aircraft carriers. Her presence in the Solomons and later in the Central Pacific provided a strategic deterrent. Japanese commanders, well aware of the lethal efficiency Washington had displayed at Iron Bottom Sound, were cautious in engaging surface forces at night. The ship's reputation, although muted in the public eye, became a quiet psychological weapon, her very presence forcing enemy fleets to reconsider their plans. Yet this period of operational consistency was accompanied by a broader, more complex narrative about battleships in World War II. By 1944, the rise of carrier aviation was undeniable. Naval aviation now dictated the pace of the war, striking targets hundreds of miles away and challenging traditional notions of surface warfare. Even so, Washington's effectiveness in the Solomon Islands demonstrated that battleships remained relevant under the right circumstances, particularly for night engagements, anti-surface operations, and coastal bombardment where air support was limited or unavailable. During the campaigns in the Marshalls and Marianas, Washington's guns decimated enemy fortifications, cleared the way for amphibious landings, and provided a stable, mobile artillery platform unmatched by any other weapon in the theater. Her radar-directed fire control continued to refine the Navy's understanding of night gunnery, creating a standard for all subsequent battleship operations. Yet, despite her critical contributions, public perception of her role remained minimal. The limelight of aviation victories, with pilots returning triumphant from daring raids, overshadowed the silent, destructive work done by a ship operating under cover of darkness and relying on unseen electronic eyes. The paradox of USS Washington's service was that she was both indispensable and invisible. Her most significant victory, Kuroshima's destruction at Guadalcanal, had turned the tide of a campaign, yet she received little fanfare. The ship became an enduring case study in military history, a vessel whose value was measured not by the number of photographs or the headlines she inspired, but by the precision, discipline, and strategic impact she demonstrated when it mattered most. In early 1944, the ship faced one of her rare non-combat crises, a collision with USS Indiana during refueling operations at sea. The accident severely damaged Washington's bow, forcing her to undergo emergency repairs at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Despite this setback, the repairs offered an opportunity for modernization. Her bow was reconstructed, streamlined, and reinforced, ensuring that the ship returned to the fleet with even greater seaworthiness and efficiency. The crew, undeterred, used this period to train further, refining damage control procedures, fire drills, and coordination with carrier groups. Every challenge became a lesson, and every lesson became a tool for survival and effectiveness in future engagements. As the Pacific theater moved closer to Japan, Washington participated in operations that showcased the synergy of battleship and carrier tactics. She escorted fast carrier groups during the invasions of the Philippines, provided fire support for landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and bombarded Japanese home islands in the final months of the war. Her secondary and tertiary armaments proved vital against smaller craft and coastal installations, while her main battery delivered devastating punishment to strategic targets. Though battleship duels became increasingly rare, Washington's contribution was unquestionable. She provided stability, firepower, and protection in a war dominated by speed and air power. After Japan's surrender, USS Washington returned to the United States as a decorated, yet largely unheralded, veteran of the Pacific Campaign. She was decommissioned in 1947 and placed in the reserve fleet. Unlike the USS Missouri, where the surrender was signed, or the Iowa and New Jersey, which saw extensive Cold War service, Washington quietly entered a period of dormancy. Her legacy, though impressive among naval circles, faded from public memory. This silence led to decades of historical oversight. Many textbooks and documentaries focused on carriers, submarines, and famous battles, leaving Washington's achievements buried in footnotes. Historians debated her significance, often questioning the relevance of battleships in an era defined by aircraft. Critics argued that she was merely one ship among many, while enthusiasts pointed to the decisive night action at Guadalcanal as evidence of her extraordinary value. Over time, however, historical re-evaluation restored her reputation. Researchers revisited after-action reports, radar logs, and eyewitness accounts. They examined the Guadalcanal engagement with precision, highlighting how USS Washington's radar-directed fire destroyed Hiroshima in 10 minutes, effectively neutralizing a key Japanese threat. The ship's ability to deliver accurate, concentrated fire while remaining undetected represented a technological and tactical breakthrough, influencing naval doctrine for decades to come. Modern naval scholars now describe Washington as a bridge between eras, a battleship that retained the destructive capability of traditional dreadnoughts, yet incorporated electronic warfare, speed, and advanced gunnery into a modern operational framework. Her service validated the principle that innovation, training, and leadership could elevate a single vessel above the ordinary, creating strategic outcomes far beyond what might be expected from her displacement or armament alone. USS Washington also symbolizes the human dimension of naval warfare. Her crew endured relentless conditions, the oppressive heat of the tropics, the constant threat of enemy attack, and the psychological toll of night combat. They mastered technology and discipline to a degree rarely seen in naval history. Their cohesion, trust, and professionalism allowed the ship to execute missions flawlessly, turning human effort into an extension of technological precision. In this sense, the ship and her crew were inseparable. Her legacy is as much a testament to human skill as it is to steel and machinery. Yet the story of USS Washington is also one of humility. Despite her monumental contributions, she never became a cultural icon. She did not feature prominently in films, propaganda, or public ceremonies. Her achievements were recorded, but quietly, in logs, reports, and the memories of those who served. This contrasts sharply with other battleships that survived the war or participated in highly publicized events. In this understated presence lies part of her mystique. Washington was a ship that performed extraordinary feats without seeking recognition, proving that the measure of a battleship's greatness is not fame but effectiveness. As decades passed, interest in Washington resurged among historians, modelers, and naval enthusiasts. Her service in Guadalcanal became a case study in naval warfare, demonstrating the interplay of technology, leadership, and crew proficiency. Her radar-directed night gunnery is often cited as a precursor to modern precision warfare at sea. Her ability to survive collisions, rough seas, and enemy attacks illustrates the resilience built into her design. And her quiet success underscores an enduring lesson. In war, outcomes are often determined not by the loudest or most famous actors, but by the competent, disciplined, and prepared. Today, USS Washington occupies a unique place in naval history. She is celebrated among scholars and veterans for her decisive impact, while remaining a symbol of the unsung heroes of the Pacific War. Her story highlights the evolution of battleship warfare, the integration of radar and technology, and the critical importance of leadership and training. While her steel no longer floats, her legacy continues to influence naval doctrine, inspire historians, and remind us of a time when one ship, perfectly executed, could change the course of a campaign. The tale of USS Washington closes not with fireworks or grand ceremonies, but with reflection, a battleship that embodied innovation, discipline, and lethality, whose greatest victories were decisive yet largely unrecognized by the public. She was the silent giant of the Pacific, the sword of the U.S. Navy that struck unseen and true. And in the annals of history, her story stands as a testament to what is possible when technology, training, and courage converge. For those who seek the real heroes of World War II, it is not always the ships in the limelight or the photographs in the newspapers that deserve the most attention. Sometimes, it is the quiet, disciplined, and deadly presence of a ship like USS Washington, a vessel that performed with unparalleled precision, altered the course of battles, and yet remained almost invisible to the broader world, that embodies the true measure of naval excellence.